Well, as the rain lashes against the windows here in my loft, I'm going to take a few moments to talk with you about the subject of silence. And I want to do so from Zephaniah chapter 1. And I'll be reading from verse 7 and picking a few verses out from the chapter as I go along. Be silent before the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is near. At that time I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and I will punish the men who are complacent, those who say in their hearts, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill. Their goods shall be plundered, and their houses laid waste. Though they build houses, they shall not inhabit them. Though they plant vineyards, they shall not drink wine from them. The great day of the Lord is near, near and hastening fast. The sound of the day of the Lord is bitter. The mighty man cries aloud there. A day of wrath is that day, a day of distress and anguish, a day of ruin and devastation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet blast and battle cry, against the fortified cities and against the lofty battlements. Be silent before the Lord God. I guess our first encounter with this word, silence, may well have been a negative one. A teacher standing in front of a class filled with disinterested children, repeatedly and pointlessly shouting it. As we get older, it's something that many of us long for more and more, but which we don't get the chance to enjoy or to become very familiar with. We don't experience silence a great deal in the modern world. Busyness, information overload, crowded spaces, competition and conflict, all of these rob us of the chance to really get to know what silence is all about. If silence is experienced as a norm in our society, then it's in the tragic form of loneliness. The person who's been forgotten, overlooked, and left alone in their own silent world. But silence can be such a precious experience. It can be that moment when we press the reset button on our thinking. It can give us that space where we feel what's needed to feel, but which our crowded lives don't allow us. It can be the catalyst for a new way of being in the world. Zephaniah lived in the 7th century BC, and these were really turbulent times in what we now know as the Middle East. The two old superpowers, Egypt and Assyria, had long been at each other's throats, but now both were being threatened by the new kid on the block, Babylon. The world of international politics was in upheaval, and within that context, the leaders of the smaller nations were busily trying to guess which horse to back. Do they stick with their old overlords, whether that was Egypt or Assyria, or do they jump ship and back Babylon? Either way, the kings and the ruling classes were gripped and held tight by self-interest. Their greatest worry was self-preservation. And their religious practices, and therefore the moral leadership they offered to their nations, were completely determined by what was acceptable to whichever superpower they were siding with. Now, for the prophets of Judah, like Zephaniah, this was the greatest tragedy. Zephaniah and his predecessors had witnessed successive kings throw the tiny bit of weight that they had behind Egypt, and because of this, destroy the religious, moral, and ethical framework of the life of their nation. And as they surveyed the consequences, what they saw was injustice and the exploitation of the weak. You see, for the prophets, as for everyone in the ancient world, religion wasn't a matter of privately held beliefs about what God is like or what the gods are like. Religion was about the whole of life, Religion was life. It shaped the civic life of the nation, and it governed the relationships of a nation's citizens with each other. It was the air that individuals and nations breathed. But Zephaniah's indignation was stirred not only by the actions of the ruling classes, but also by their arrogance. And this arrogance is to be seen in the way they boasted about what they were doing, bragging that they will get away with it, bragging that God isn't going to do anything, that there'll be no comeback. As they say in this chapter, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill. And so Zephaniah calls for silence, for the boasting to stop, for the arrogance to end, for silence to fill that space where pride and self-interest had paraded themselves. But silence is important for us all, not just for self-centered rulers. Silence creates a space for us to feel and to think and to be. The silence that Zephaniah calls for is a silence that brings us into the presence of God, a silence in which we step away from the noise, the busyness, the conflicts and the worries that fill our souls, a silence that allows us to step into that space where we can see and understand ourselves as being God's creatures, living under God's benign and good rule. And so I want to speak briefly about three kinds of silence: a silence of reflection, a silence of listening, and a silence of anticipation. First of all, a silence of reflection. Stepping away from the white noise of our lives gives us the opportunity to reflect on the whys and the wherefores of our experiences. It gives us the space to see our own selfishness and how it impacts not only our lives, but the lives of others as well. But this silence also allows us to reflect on the causes of this selfishness. What is it that we're really after here? Why do we see other people as competitors or as threats? What is it that we're really protecting? Now, it is of course possible to use silence to plot and plan our next selfish move, to scheme our way to the top at the expense of others, or to nurture our grievances against those who have hurt us. But when that silence is a silence in the presence of God, the kind of silence that Zephaniah calls for, then we're invited to step out of these games that can so dominate our lives and find a better way of being in the world. This isn't a form of escapism, nor does this silence magically make our problems disappear. But it does give us the opportunity to approach them with a different mindset, to process the experience and to relate differently to those who are caught up in these problems with us. Secondly, there's the silence of listening. Silence, I guess, is never really total. There's always some background noise, like the rain that's lashing the windows in this room. But in that silence with its background noises, we can journey into these background noises and hear how these noises tell us so much about who, when, and what we are. First, there's the sound of road and rail traffic, of airplanes and distant voices, the sounds of civilizations, which if you take a moment to be silent yourself, you'll notice almost straight away. But behind this sound of civilization, there's the sound of nature. Birdsong, barking dogs, rustling of leaves, falling of the rain. And behind these again, there's the sound of the passing of time, the ticking of the clock, the beating of our heart, the whisper of our breath escaping our nostrils. All of these sounds speak to us about when we are, what we are, and who we are. They ground us in the here and now. They affirm our existence, and they locate us in God's world and in God's story. For that reason, these sounds are important to listen to. This silence, the silence of listening, gives us the space to place the noise of our lives in its proper context. But it also allows us to place our own lives into their proper context, which is God's world. And in this silence of listening, the anxiety that drives our competitiveness, that fuels much of our behavior in this world, and the anger that is behind retaliation, these destructive, negative, unhelpful emotions can all be stilled. And then thirdly, there's the silence of anticipation. Zephaniah calls on his contemporaries to use this silence to think about a future time. He calls this future time the day of the Lord, and he portrays it as a day of judgment. And what this means is that God will undo all that is done in the name of selfishness. And so he's inviting the ruling classes to consider what will be left of their works then, what will be left of them. For all their pride, for all their boasting, their efforts and their works won't survive the day when the Lord comes. But behind these words of judgment, there is also the anticipation of better things. In doing away with everything that harms, that exploits, and that abuses, God is at the same time creating a new world. A world of peace, a world where we can all flourish. Silence in the presence of God throws us forward into that future age, an age created by God through Jesus Christ, through his life and through his resurrection. Silence in God's presence allows us to see that age and to refill our depleted souls with hope. So let me encourage you to create that time and space in your life to be silent in the presence of God, to reflect on what has been, to listen to what is, and to anticipate on what is to come. Silence in God's presence allows us to connect with the past, with the present, and with the future of God's work. What he has done, what he is doing, and what he will do. In this way, this silence puts everything in our lives in its proper context.